And for our next session, I want to welcome back Jeet, who will be in conversation with Arundhathi Subramaniam about her latest book, which is called Love Without a Story, which is a book of poems. Please welcome back Jeet and Arundhathi Subramaniam.
Jeet has just asked me if I'd say a few words, and I'm not quite sure what to say other than the fact that I can't think of a better interlocutor than Jeet, and to be reading subsequently with Ranjit Hoskote for many reasons. Most importantly, that they're poets whose work has been with me a long time, poets whose work I admire, but also because we have a particular connection, which is this absolutely crazy, impossible city to which we belong. Mumbai, Bombay, the city that goes by many names, a city that some of us have managed to escape from and still spend our time feeling nostalgic about.
Thanks so much. Great way to frame this conversation. I'd just like to start by saying a couple of things about the nature of this transaction or interaction or whatever you might want to call it. It feels very strange to be sitting on a stage looking into a sea of expectant or jaded or hopeful or hopeless faces and tired or untired, and to ask yourself, when and how did it come to this? Poetry as a product to be consumed in the antiseptic, or to use a word that Arundhathi uses in her poem, which I will read in just a minute. Poetry as a product to be consumed in the antiseptic or deodorized environs of a luxury hotel. A poetry festival is a kind of a contradiction in terms. It's like the phrase military intelligence. There's no intelligence in the military. Poetry exists beyond monetization, beyond maximization, beyond infiltration. It exists beyond conversation, and it shouldn't be lectured upon the way I'm lecturing right now. And talking about poetry rather than, say, reading a poem aloud or in silence is like climbing into a perfumed bath with your shoes on. It's a bit of an abomination, and it reminds me that by talking about poetry, we take the poetry out of poetry. And it reminds me of the Bombay poets, the Bombay schools, the Bombay school, and the poets who were personalities with a capital P. And these were poets that Arundhathi and I and Ranjit, when we were young poets, had to kind of grapple with in many ways. I'm talking about the practitioners of the Bombay school, Yunus and Dom and Nissim and Arun and Adil. They were great shades, and sometimes those shades were so great you couldn't grow in them. You had to kind of lift them over to get into your own work. So I would like to use that as a kind of a framework in which to read a poem by Arundhathi that begins this amazing book, the first poem in this book, which also begins with a line by Yunus D'Souza. And that line is, "Best to meet in poems." This is a poem called "I Grew Up in an Age of Poets." I grew up in an age of poets who told me joy was for cabbages, until I found that beneath their smoking empires of sulfur, there lay a shiver of doubt. That they wondered, as I did, about what it might mean to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes at different ends. I'm so sorry. To be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars and still stay green. Chaotically, wetly, powerfully green. Now I meet poets who exchange visiting cards, are best friends with the dentist, all dankness deodorized, their poems cool seashells, their laughter splintered eggshells, poets who never seem to wonder about cabbages at all. Still best to meet in poems. I wonder if you'd like to say just a couple of words about that school and a lineage that I can see in that poem.
You can see the lineage, huh?
Very much.
Mm-hmm. Looking back, I feel a great sense of gratitude, actually, for an ecosystem that I think Bombay provided. The sense that one had access to a living history of Anglophone poetry. It was a living history. We had people, whether we knew them or not at the start, we did later, but whether it was Arun Kolatkar sitting hunched over his plate at the Wayside Inn in Kala Ghoda, or whether it was Nissim presiding over the PEN meetings, or the person who eventually you could take across the road to have a pumpkin halwa with. That sense of a living tradition of poetry, I'm grateful for. And yet, there are many qualities, I think, that if you can see the sense of lineage, one probably imbibed them without even being terribly conscious of it. And I think one of them was an attention to craft, an attention to form, the sense that it wasn't enough to just splatter yourself on a page, that in some way it was important to go back and consciously work with a poem, and that craft wasn't a dirty word. I think this was an important takeaway. Whether it could have been done differently, Jeet, I often wonder. I sometimes feel it was a great generation of senior poets, some of whom later became friends. But one of the things I feel it could have been perhaps is I'm wondering whether it could have been a more hospitable space. Did you feel that?
Very much. And I also felt it was a kind of a club, a male club of boys, old boys, old drunk boys sometimes, who refused to allow younger poets in. And I think also were very doubly suspicious of young female poets. I mean, the only woman poet in that bunch of drunk boys was Eunice. So I'd love to hear something about that.
Yeah. So Eunice is invoked in this poem because she, in fact, taught me as well. She was my professor at St. Xavier's. And she was an important presence. You couldn't miss Eunice D'Souza. She was an iconic presence at Xavier's. But the use of that epigraph is ironic because, yes, it's true, it's a poem by Eunice that I love, but it's also true that for many years, it seemed to me best to meet Eunice in poems, as it seemed to me to meet many poets, happiest to meet in poems. That changed. That changed as I grew older and perhaps less angular, and as those poets themselves grew older and wobblier.
And got mellower in some ways.
And got mellower, as perhaps we are today. So it is an interesting journey, really. And I think, one of the aspirations, which I'm not sure I'm able to quite live up to, but an aspiration I set myself, is there a way to inhabit a scene, a way that's rigorous, but not mean-spirited, to welcome rigor and strenuousness, but not turn ungenerous.
Funny you should say that. I was thinking about the poetry circle at one point, where a lot of young poets met. And I remember I came to one meeting of the poetry circle and never came back because the thing that I took away from that was a mean-spiritedness, because the way they went after each other's poems, there was no kindness there. It was so mean. And I really saw that as an effect of the older poets. Because the at least this was a circle that you could sit in. The older poets, they wouldn't even sit with you. If you talked about it as a clubhouse, they wouldn't, never mind allowing you in the front door, they wouldn't even allow you on their porch, you know.
Yes. Yes, I think, I mean, having been part of the poetry circle in the city, I must say we've had our very savage meetings. I think people have gone away pretty brutalized. But I also think that it was a space that evolved ways of talking about poetry that we've all benefited from subsequently. It took us time, perhaps. But I think we learned that the idea was perhaps to critique a poem if it was a work in progress, but not to try and silence the poet. It took us time to learn that. I think we may have got there, maybe not collectively.
So, also, I'd love to ask you a couple of things about this book. Could you tell us what the title means, Love Without a Story? And is it, I mean, when I see that title, I think we are now living in a post-love story age, perhaps?
Yeah, I think we are. And I think I'm interested really in what happens to love after all the ups and downs and the highs and lows of the emotional cardiogram subside. And what's left? I think something is left. And as I grow older, I think I feel that more. There is a certain expansiveness, there is a certain warmth, which is not gooey. There's a certain affection, there's a certain humor, but it's not sentimental. And that interests me. That inner condition interests me. It's not a static condition. And so maybe I will actually quote those few lines from the poem that mentions it. It's a few lines from a poem on Avvaiyar, the legendary woman poet, the wise woman of Tamil literature. The lines go, for lovers flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the world, love without a story.
I think what is left is love without a story and poetry. Many of the things that you were saying just now as you were talking about sentiment or emotion without gooiness, I thought could absolutely apply to these poems as well.
Thank you, Jeet.
My
Thank
pleasure.
You so much.
Arundhathi Subramaniam, pick up this book, get her to sign it.
Thank you.
Real pleasure to be here.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jeet.
Have you stay on stage, and thank you, Jeet, for joining us. And I'd like to next welcome Ranjit Hoskote, who will be joining Arundhathi to read a couple of poems.
Did you say read a couple of poems? I hope we can do more than that. Okay.
Well, okay, this was lovely. I have the impression that we're in Bombay for obscure reasons, or not so obscure reasons. Arundhathi, well, maybe we should just continue with you reading. Why don't you read a poem, and then we'll...
I think we should say something about the title. We decided to call the title of this particular session is Love in Unreal Times. And both Ranjit and I agreed on that. Do you want to say why that particular title resonated?
At least partly because the pressure of the urgencies that we're dealing with now is such that we're constantly being drawn out into public spaces of engagement, of confrontation. And in times like that, how do we pull back to things that are deeply and intimately real to us? So the times seem to take on a certain surreal, even unreal quality. We can't believe that we are in these times. Sometimes you feel you're in the 1930s in Central Europe. And against that kind of backdrop, how do we lead our individual lives? That's something I was definitely thinking about.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the fact that, love is a word that we perhaps use more than ever before. And we are constantly messaging each other. The instantaneous communication that's possible allows us, if we choose, to express love all the time. Emojis, of course, all of that. But does it make love any simpler? Does it make it any easier to invoke love in poetry? These are some of the questions I've been thinking about too. Okay, I'm going to read a very short poem and all the poems I read today, I promise, will be short. So we can, I know that we might be running over time. But I'm going to start with a poem that, in fact, almost became the reason why this book took on its title, Love Without a Story. It's a poem called The Strange Thing About Love. The strange thing about love is that it melts you into an amateur, never again a professional, even on the subject of yourself. The strange thing about love is that you disagree wildly, and then figure it's wiser to dance. The strange thing about love is that it evicts you from the land of echoes that you thought was home and leads you to friends sitting under the stars in ancient bewilderment.
I'm going to read an older poem. It's from an earlier book called Vanishing Acts. Effects of Distance. Call it providence if the day should turn upon its hinges, letting light colonize this empire of jars and shutters, this room. A telegram on the rack spells hands that burn because you did not reply, did not realize that some words are too proud to remind you they came. Blue is the color of air letters, of conquerors' eyes. Blue leaking from your pen triggers this enterprise. Never journey far from me, and if you must, find towpaths, trails, follow the portents fugitives trust to guide them out and back, and at some fork, pause, and climbing in twilight though you may be, somewhere address this heart's unease, this heart's unanswered wilderness.
I was just thinking of what Jeet said about that single poetry circle meeting that he attended. And I'm wondering whether it's just nostalgia that makes me look back on some of those meetings with deep affection. I think it's more than nostalgia. What do you think?
There was always blood on the walls.
There was blood on
But
the walls.
I think what I remember of those years is that we were all really passionately committed to the idea of working on our poetry. So a lot of that cruelty was actually in the service of this larger cause. It wasn't personal.
I think the cruelty could have been toned down. But maybe it's because I've been away so long and I'm just so much older. I have different kinds of love poems in this book, and some of them are just love poems, as in the love of friends, the kind of warmth that you feel when you think back on a certain kind of conversation you could only have in perhaps a university cafeteria or with friends at the poetry circle, when the sunlight is kind of immaculate, the world is fresh and new, missing friends. In another land, my friends are sad. The planet is smoldering, they say, like never before. I remember the times we ordered our brun maskas, ran fingers over formica tables, sticky, with Kolatkar, Pound, Almodovar, Clarice Lispector, Nammalvar. At times, we'd disagree. Teilhard de Chardin, he'd say. Salim Chishti. Tukaram, you'd reply. Pinkola Estes, and sometimes irrelevantly, Agatha Christie. And we'd shake our heads sadly. Gandhi, Gandhi, Gandhi. It was a world of common nouns we inhabited. Comforting, really. Not unlike that darker age of innocence when I thought Coca-Cola was spelt lowercase and came from a fruit. We'd laugh immoderately over the haiku poet whose CV was never a haiku. Spend the ritual half hour on God, on death. In another land, my friends are sad. Their tables still sticky with Octavio Paz and simmering teas. The right and left have failed us, they say, then head to eat Lebanese. Some days, I miss friends.
There's a very strong sense that we are now a generation that will shortly be pilloried by someone else.
We anticipated that, right, Jeet, in our conversation? We anticipated that by saying we were, we were getting there, we were mellow too now.
Yeah. So maybe I'll actually read a poem from Central Time that is dedicated to Jeet. It's called The Postman's Last Song for the Moon. You glide in plain view, gravity's nearest slave, floating outside our windows, just out of reach, an ice fruit we'd love to pluck from the sky's jet branches. What stops us is we know the tides would roar and lunge, break their contract if we did. Wall-high waves rushing houses and stores, vaulting over gates, an army of madmen dancing on drowned asphalt. Rain-wrapped, fog-tangled, how easily we forget. Oceans that have dried and shrunk to ravines where the eye never settles, the heart now never goes. Like the sea of tranquility, so wildly utopian, we gave it to you, tattooed it on your skin's acceptance. Safe behind glass and our chartreuse curtains, we watch it float by on full moon nights and smile. The mortgage of our nights and days is so quickly claimed. You measure breadth in the centuries it takes to carve a pensive ellipse through space. Messages conveyed, you dip below moldy clouds, or submit with reluctance to an eclipse, never more than half deciphered. You keep your dark side hidden as you shine, a riddle orbiting in the wide open eye. Sickle of the harvest, lantern of our last rooms, green moon of January nights, you'll bark at our windows, a dog begging for a bone long after we're gone. Other voices will wake up to answer. Survivors from the minefields of sleep, they will pelt you with curses, extradite you to memory.
I thought I would move, Ranjit, to a couple of poems in the book which are about moving from friends to parents. That's another kind of love that for me is very much, that I notice is strong in the book. I'd like to read two very short poems. Parents. They vanish as abruptly as they appear, busy perfecting the art of truancy when they send you away to school. They cry wolf many times over. But when you turn for a moment, they melt away. Velvet-pawed, sure-footed into the night. And here's another poem, which is about the moment when parents often seem like geography, right? They're just the foundation of one's life. They're the architecture of one's life. It often takes time to disengage them, to actually see them as individuals. So this is about a particular moment when geography disengaged itself and presented itself to me as a person, when landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in the drawing room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high arched feet. Better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice, like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know just how to incline her neck, just when to sip her swirly drink. And she understood the language of baritone voices and lacquered nails and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in a wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe.
So returns to our childhood in the 70s with the emergency and with other kinds of historical events. This is called First Lessons in Distance. On the clearest January night one year in Fatorda, my father taught me to thread the stars with the needle of Greek legend. Blackout paper still blocked the windows. On the East Coast, enemy soldiers were being marched captive through mangrove swamps under burning clouds. But grenades and battle fatigues were alien to my 3-year-old eyes. Unscarred by TV and the reading lamp, they widened to hold Rigel's blowtorch blue edge and Aldebaran's red halo. My father taught me to catch the fainter stars by sleight of glance from the corner of the eye. Years later, standing beneath a Midwestern sky, wide bowl, 4 jet trails blooming in it, I remembered our needlework of pinpoint and name, light years away from Earth, first lessons in distance.
It's interesting how we come back to distance. Huh? We were promised to read some honest-to-goodness romantic love poems, but not just yet. One of the things that interested me when I was putting this book together is all kinds of definitions of love. So the love as defined by friends, as defined by parents, lovers, Marxists, mystics, monks, the whole lot of them. I wanted all of them in this book.
That's the title for a new book, Marxists, Mystics, Monks.
It is, isn't it? But on that note, I'm actually going to read a poem called The Monk. The monk, who's been in silence 16 years, writes me a note at a yak tea stall, skirted by ragged prayer flags in a grey, hiccuping wind, on the road to Kailash. His face is scarp and fissure and gleaming teeth. He spends each day cleaning his shrine. It's worth it, he says. I clean the shrine, it cleans me. He was a spare parts dealer in a time he barely remembers, before he was tripped up by something that felt like a granite mountain in reverse, the deepest pothole he's ever known. Too deep to be called love. That turned him into a spare part himself, utterly dispensable, wildly unemployed. And if there is another lifetime, this is what I'd ask for, he says. And now he doesn't laugh. Same silence, same cleaning.
But love can also be a love of place, and a love of places remembered, places inherited and lost. So I'm going to maybe read two poems that have to do with that sort of love of place, of buildings that now don't exist or are very close to, or do not exist in the same form. This is called Reading a Script at Ziyarat Dastgir Sobon. Ziyarat Dastgir Sobon, for those of you who know Srinagar, is one of the most beautiful shrines in the valley. Proverbs fall from the saint's upturned bowl. Beneath the cypress, work is a steel-gray word. Thought is plum, and prayer a mournful green. A cube with 3 lacquered walls and a broken face holds them together. The almond merchant shuffles past the lake without humming. The singer hides his voice under a scarf. The guide won't admit to his compass. They are actors in a long-running movie about comets, in which a pair of hands wash themselves at a fountain over and over, the soundtrack worn out, silence dripping from the stripped chinar and the charred roof to the headstones buried in snow. And this is called The Myth of Eternal Return. I spent part of my childhood in Goa and then never went back for about 25 years. So that's about large in the imagination. So this is called The Myth of Eternal Return. You leave the megaphone on the beach and nature to its own devices. Tread sand, paddle across clumped seaweed, and speak to the road watched by latticed eyes. Palm green is the color of asylum here, and sleep comes quickly in its shade. Here's where you rest from the water that burnt your hands at noon. But rest is hard work. Every turn seems wrong. And where the chapel stood, a rusting sentry points to a lane that climbs among houses and no hill. Your words grow lean and spare when breath is crafting ways to temper a slope. The croton leaves that speckled the wall are ash, but the east windows still give on the bamboo grove. Trying the gate, you look along the leaf-swept drive. The woman bending over Caesar's grave is the girl who raced you up the hill. She won, you fell, and have a scar on the forehead to prove it. You wait for her to turn. It's me, you say, after all these years.
I was actually wondering whether to read a monsoon poem, but I've decided not to. I will do the honest-to-goodness love poem. This is actually, well, I'm not going to give it. This has an epigraph by John Berger that says, "The tongue is alone and tethered in its mouth." So it's a poem called Tongue. The man in front of me is reading a balance sheet. He is smiling, his gaze shimmying between columns, effortlessly bilingual. And though a little drunk on the liquor of profit, I like to think he is not immune to the sharp beauty of integers simmering with their own inner life. And I wonder if he feels the way I do sometimes around words, waiting for them to lead me past the shudder of taproot, past the inkiness of groundwater, to those places where all tongues meet. Calculus, Persian, Kokborok, flamenco. The tongue sparrows know, and accountants, and those palm trees at the far end of holiday photographs. Your tongue, mine. The kiss that knows from where the first songs sprang, forested and densely plural. The kiss that knows no separation. Since we're on the subject of honest to goodness love, I'm going to do one more, and then I'll pass it on to Ranjit, who will have to read Strawberry Morning.
Seriously, I haven't even brought it with me.
You haven't brought it?
No.
Strawberry Morning is from Ranjit Hoskote's very first book. It's the one poem I understood in that book.
Oh, for Christ's sake.
And it's the poem that
She's
he hasn't...
supposed to be my friend, by the way.
We're old poetry circle walas with blood splattered on the walls. But no, it's a fine poem, and I would suggest that you go out and excavate it. It must be on the net somewhere. I'm going to move on to a poem called Let Me Be Adjective. I should just say one thing here, and that is that one of the things that's always fascinated me about the wonderful tradition of sacred poetry, bhakti poetry in the subcontinent, is that it allows you this incredible license to write erotic and existential verse all at the same time. The fact that you don't have to choose, you can bring both within the same poem, within the same frame. Let me be adjective. And so, the verb is all. But I'm not ready for it yet. I tie knots every now and then to dam the flow, to pretend I am thing. I am thing, and to pretend you are too. More thing than I, worthier of being described. And until the knots come undone, as one day they must, let me modify, qualify, anoint, counterpoint, apostrophize, parenthesize, invent, dissent. Let me sing you. I suppose I'm asking, like the old bards did, to be your garland. Not always tenderly floral, just a little tart, a little contrary, the kind that isn't always allowed within walled gardens. But even as I meander, let my trail be the thread that completes the circle that I long to make around you. Love, let me be adjective.
I think I'm going to read a poem that has to do with love with a story and love after the story. It's one of the oldest stories in India. It's been told 100 times, 300 times at least. And this is a poem called After the Story. From the anthill came the voice. 2 white birds perched on a branch, one killed by a hunter's arrow, the first poem written in its blood. The morning sage's sudden curse falls on the hunter's ear as verse. From the anthill came the voice. Prisoner on the island of his suspicions, alone under his white silk canopy, He murmurs the chants that his aging priests heap on the fire sacrifice. Then from nowhere, two boys' voices, high flutes above the drone, dropped masks, startled faces. The boys sing. From the anthill came the voice of the golden deer in the forest, the princess carried off by the demon chief, the war, the siege, the giant red monkey cartwheeling across the sky and burning the island fortress. When the war ends, the prince fixes his wife's 14-year wait with a cold stare and an ordeal by fire. The fire plays honest witness. From the anthill came the voice, but the prince cannot bridge a distance greater than the stormy sea. Doubt again for him, again exile for her, love twisted and beaten on a washerman's stone. At last she will have had enough of his tests. She will ask the furrowed earth to swallow her. He stands up shaking, his eyes opened wide, as his children sing to the king his own story.
We have to vacate, Ranjit. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Ranjit, really.
Thank you,
It was
Arun.
lovely it was
fun.
lovely. And it's not just Strawberry Morning. There's a lot else of Ranjit Hoskote's that's well worth reading. Go out there and pick up his books.
Thank you. This is a session one hoped would not end. It was so healing. Thank you very much. And thanks for giving a sneak peek into the old times. And it was lovely to see the camaraderie between all you poets. And more to that. A huge round of applause for Arundhathi and Ranjit Hoskote.